The room carried the weight of 1,000 sunsets, each one filtering through lace curtains and painting the wooden floor with fading stripes. Clara knelt by her bedside, hands clasped tight enough to whiten her knuckles. Her voice barely disturbed the dust motes floating in the evening light. For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful. Amen. From the perch near the window, a flash of green feathers stirred. Jasper bobbed his head, yellow eyes fixed on Clara. Amen, the parrot echoed, his voice a perfect mimic of her gentle cadence. Clara smiled, pushing herself up from creaking knees. At 68, the simple act of kneeling had become its own form of penance. She crossed to Jasper's cage, fingers reaching through the bars to stroke his vibrant plumage. Good boy, she whispered. The parrot tilted his head, considering her with one bright eye. Then, without warning, he spoke again. Joseph buried him. Joseph buried him by the creek. Clara's hand froze. The words hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass. She taught Jasper to say grace, to wish her good morning, to mimic the sound of the telephone. But not this. Never this. Hush now, she said, voice barely audible. She turned away, hands trembling as she pulled the cover over his cage. Outside, the last light drained from the sky, leaving the farmhouse in darkness. The Caldwell farm had stood for over a century, weathering storms both natural and man-made. Once white clapboard, now peeled in long strips, revealing gray wood beneath. The wraparound porch sagged in the middle like an old horse's back. Clara had been born in the upstairs bedroom, had watched her parents die in the same house, and had lived out 43 years of marriage under its roof. Now she inhabited it alone, save for Jasper. Morning found her at the kitchen table, a chipped mug of black coffee warming her hands. Through the window, she could see the overgrown garden, tomato plants sprawling untamed across the beds. Beyond lay fields she'd long since stopped cultivating, stretching toward the tree line that marked the edge of her property. Clara's days followed the same pattern. Breakfast at 6, tending the garden until the heat became too much, lunch at noon, reading or mending in the afternoon, dinner at 5, and bed by 9. Jasper provided the only real conversation in her life, though the mailman stopped to chat on Tuesdays and Fridays. Going to be another scorcher, she told Jasper as she filled his water dish. The parrot watched her with those knowing eyes, head cocked to one side. Scorcher, he agreed, before plucking a sunflower seed from his dish. Clara moved through the house like a ghost, dusting photographs she rarely looked at anymore. Her wedding portrait. Joseph in his Sunday best, arm around her waist. Their faces young and unlined, unaware of what lay ahead. No children had blessed their union, a fact that had once felt like punishment but later seemed like mercy. The mail arrived at 11, slipping through the tarnished slot with a metallic scrape. Clara gathered the envelopes from the floor, a power bill, a seed catalog, and a cream-colored envelope bearing the town seal. She opened the last one with a butter knife, sliding it beneath the flap with practiced precision. The letter inside was printed on heavy paper, the kind reserved for official business. Dear Mrs. Caldwell, it began. The Town Council of Millfield cordially invites you to attend a community meeting regarding the upcoming 30th anniversary memorial service for Timothy Lawson. Clara's hands began to shake. The paper trembled, words blurring before her eyes. 30 years. Had it really been so long since they'd found the boy's bicycle by Harker's Creek, its front wheel still spinning slowly in the mud? Joseph buried him, Jasper said from his perch, voice clear as a bell. Joseph buried him by the creek. Clara looked up sharply. Who taught you to say that? She demanded, though she knew no one had. The parrot merely blinked, preening his wing feathers as though he hadn't spoken at all. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the town hall. Clara spent the intervening days in a fog of memory and dread, her hands moving mechanically through familiar tasks while her mind circled like a bird over dangerous waters. Timothy Lawson had been 12 years old when he disappeared. A quiet boy with a shock of red hair and a spray of freckles across his nose. He delivered their newspaper, always carefully placing it on the porch rather than throwing it in the yard like his predecessor. Joseph had commented on the boy's politeness more than once. Clara stood before her closet Thursday afternoon, fingers trailing over garments she rarely wore anymore. She settled on a navy dress with small white flowers, the same one she'd worn to Joseph's funeral 4 years prior. The irony wasn't lost on her. Jasper watched from his cage as she pinned her silver hair into a neat bun. Pretty, he said, the word Joseph had taught him to say whenever Clara dressed up. Thank you, she replied automatically, though her stomach clenched at the memory. The town hall stood at the center of Millfield, its brick facade and white columns a testament to more prosperous times. Clara parked her aging Buick in the nearly full lot, recognizing most of the vehicles. In a town of 800 souls, anonymity was impossible. She slipped into the meeting room as quietly as she could, taking a seat in the back row. Familiar faces turned to acknowledge her, some with smiles, others with the careful neutrality reserved for widows and the bereaved. Clara nodded in return, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mayor Wilson stood at the podium, his gray suit matching his hair. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "As you know, this September marks 30 years since the tragedy that changed our community forever." Clara's gaze drifted across the room. Sarah Lawson sat in the front row, her once vibrant red hair now streaked with white. Timothy's mother had never left Millfield, had never stopped waiting for answers that never came. The Memorial Committee has proposed a permanent marker at Harker's Creek, where Timothy was last seen, the mayor continued. "We're here tonight to discuss the design and to plan the service." The meeting proceeded with the efficient politeness of small-town governance. People offered suggestions, a stone bench, a plaque, perhaps a scholarship in Timothy's name. Clara sat silently, feeling the weight of unspoken words pressing against her chest. When Sarah Lawson stood to speak, the room grew still. "I appreciate everything you all want to do," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But what I really want, what I've always wanted, is the truth. Someone in this town knows what happened to my boy." Her eyes swept the room, passing over Clara without lingering. "Someone knows, and they've kept silent for 30 years. Clara looked down at her hands, at the gold band she still wore. Joseph had been a good husband. Quiet, hard-working, respected in the community. The kind of man who tipped his hat to ladies and helped neighbors repair storm damage without being asked. The kind of man no one would ever suspect. "Mrs. Caldwell?" Clara looked up, startled to hear her name. Mayor Wilson was looking at her expectantly. "I'm sorry," she said, heat rising to her cheeks. "I was lost in thought." "I asked if you'd be willing to serve on the Memorial Committee," he repeated, "given your long standing in the community." Clara felt the eyes of the room upon her. "Of course," she heard herself say. "I'd be honored." The drive home passed in a blur. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, her thoughts racing ahead of her like frightened deer. The farmhouse loomed dark against the night sky as she pulled into the driveway, its familiar silhouette suddenly menacing. Inside, Jasper greeted her with a soft whistle. Clara uncovered his cage mechanically, her movement stiff. "Joseph buried him," the parrot said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Joseph buried him by the creek." "Stop it," Clara snapped, the first time she'd ever spoken harshly to the bird. Jasper fluttered his wings in surprise, retreating to the back of his cage. Clara sank into Joseph's old armchair, the leather sighing beneath her weight. The house pressed in around her, walls holding 30 years of secrets. Her eyes drifted to the photograph on the mantel, Joseph standing beside the old oak tree, shovel in hand, smiling at the camera. He'd been planting apple saplings that day. At least, that's what he'd told her. Sleep eluded her that night. Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering the night Timothy disappeared. Joseph had come home late, his clothes muddied, face drawn. He'd claimed to have helped Frank Miller pull his tractor from a ditch, but Frank had mentioned nothing of it when Clara ran into him at the general store the following week. There had been other signs, small inconsistencies she'd chosen not to examine too closely. The shovel that disappeared from the shed. The nightmares that plagued Joseph for months afterward, leaving him gasping and sweating in the darkness. The way he'd avoided Harker's Creek ever after, taking the long way around when they drove to town. Morning found Clara in the attic, dust motes dancing in the beam of her flashlight. Joseph's things remained boxed up, untouched since his death. She found what she was looking for in the third box, a leather-bound journal she'd given him for Christmas the year before Timothy disappeared. Clara carried it downstairs like it might explode in her hands, setting it on the kitchen table with reverent dread. Jasper watched from his cage as she opened the cover with trembling fingers. Joseph's handwriting filled the pages, neat at first, then increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. Clara skimmed the early pages, familiar accounts of weather and crop yields. Then she reached September 15th, 30 years ago. "God forgive me," the entry began. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she read on. "I didn't mean for it to happen. The boy was trespassing, fishing in our creek without permission. I only meant to scare him, to teach him a lesson about respecting private property. But he fell, hit his head on the rocks. There was so much blood. I called his name, shook him, but he was gone. What could I do? They'd never believe it was an accident. Not with my temper, not with the argument everyone saw us having at the store last week. I buried him deep, where no one will look. God forgive me, but I had no choice." Clara closed the journal, while rising in her throat. All these years, she'd suspected but never known for certain. Had chosen not to know. Joseph buried him, Jasper said softly from his cage. Joseph buried him by the creek. Now Clara understood. The parrot had been in the room when Joseph had confessed to her, voice breaking, 3 days before his heart gave out. Jasper had been listening, absorbing words spoken in anguish, storing them away like bright objects that caught his attention. For 4 years, the bird had held Joseph's confession, occasionally letting fragments slip into conversation. And for 4 years, Clara had hushed him, covered his cage, pretended not to hear. The memorial committee met weekly throughout the summer. Clara attended each meeting, her contribution limited to quiet nods and murmured agreement. The permanent marker would be a simple stone bench placed where the creek bent around the old oak tree. Ironically, not far from where Timothy's body likely lay buried. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for September 15th, the anniversary of his disappearance. As the date approached, Clara found herself standing at crossroads both literal and figurative. Each morning, she walked to the creek that bordered her property, stood at the spot where the water curved around exposed roots. Was this where it happened? Was Timothy buried nearby, his small body returned to earth while his mother searched and prayed and waited? Jasper's words followed her like shadows. Joseph buried him. Joseph buried him by the creek. The parrot seemed to sense her turmoil, repeating the phrase more frequently as September approached. The night before the ceremony, Clara sat at her kitchen table, Joseph's journal open before her. Rain tapped against the windows, a gentle percussion accompanying her thoughts. The choice before her seemed impossible: protect the memory of the man she'd loved, or give a grieving mother the truth she deserved. "What would you have me do?" she asked the empty chair across from her. Jasper, from his covered cage in the corner, offered no answer. Morning broke clear and cool, the rain having washed the world clean. Clara dressed with care, a black dress this time, more appropriate for what she intended. She transferred Jasper to his traveling cage, the parrot unusually quiet as she covered it with a dark cloth. The ceremony was set for noon. By 11, people had begun gathering at Harker's Creek, the newly installed bench gleaming in the sunlight. Clara parked at the edge of the crowd, Jasper's cage on the seat beside her. She sat watching as familiar faces arrived: the mayor, the pastor, schoolteachers and shopkeepers, farmers and their wives. And Sarah Lawson, standing straight back beside the bench that commemorated her endless loss. Clara's hand shook as she lifted Jasper's cage from the car. The weight of it anchored her, gave her purpose as she walked toward the gathering. People nodded in greeting, making way for her as she approached the front. Mayor Wilson spotted her, confusion flickering across his face at the sight of the covered cage. He was halfway through his speech, words about community and remembrance floating over the crowd like dandelion seeds. "Mrs. Caldwell," he acknowledged, pausing mid-sentence. "Did you want to say something?" Clara set Jasper's cage on the bench. The crowd murmured, uncertain. She looked directly at Sarah Lawson, seeing in the other woman's face the same lines grief had carved into her own. "I have something to share," Clara said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Something that's been kept hidden for too long." She removed the cloth from Jasper's cage. The parrot blinked in the sudden light, head swiveling to take in the crowd. "My husband Joseph died 4 years ago," Clara continued. "Before he passed, he made a confession, one that my parrot, Jasper, overheard and has repeated ever since." She opened the cage door. Jasper hopped onto her outstretched finger, green feathers iridescent in the sunlight. "Jasper," she said quietly, "tell them what Joseph said." The crowd held its breath. For a terrible moment, Clara feared the bird would remain silent, that this act of courage would collapse into humiliation. Then Jasper bobbed his head, yellow eyes scanning the gathered faces. "Joseph buried him," the parrot said clearly. "Joseph buried him by the creek." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Sarah Lawson's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes locked on Clara's face. "I found my husband's journal after the last committee meeting," Clara said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent gathering. In it, he confessed to accidentally killing Timothy during an argument, then burying his body to hide what he'd done. She reached into her purse, withdrew the leather-bound book. "The location is described here. I believe Timothy is buried on my property, near where the creek bends around the old oak." The aftermath unfolded like scenes from someone else's life. Police cars with flashing lights. Men with shovels and a ground-penetrating radar. The careful excavation of earth undisturbed for 30 years. The discovery of remains, small bones, fragments of cloth, a tarnished pocket watch with the initials TL engraved on the back. Clara watched from her porch as they carried the simple pine box across her property, Sarah Lawson walking behind it, back straight, face wet with tears. Not tears of hope destroyed, but of uncertainty finally laid to rest. No charges would be filed against Clara. The district attorney explained that withholding knowledge of a crime was not itself a crime, particularly when the knowledge came after the perpetrator's death. The town treated her with a strange mixture of respect and distance, acknowledging her courage while absorbing the shock of Joseph Caldwell's true nature. Autumn painted the countryside in flames of red and gold. Clara knelt in her garden, trowel in hand, digging a small hole beneath the ancient rosebush Joseph had planted on their 5th anniversary. From her pocket, she withdrew a rusted key, the key to the shed where he'd kept the shovel, the key she'd found hanging around his neck when they'd laid him out for burial. She placed it in the earth, covering it with soil, pressing it down with the flat of her hand. Not evidence, exactly, but a token of complicity. Of knowing but choosing not to see. Of silence maintained too long. Jasper watched from his cage on the porch, unnaturally quiet since the day of the ceremony. He'd served his purpose, had spoken truth when humans could not. Now he seemed content to return to simpler phrases, good morning and pretty bird, and amen. Clara stood, brushing dirt from her knees. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that had harbored secrets for 3 decades. From town came the distant sound of church bells, Timothy Lawson's funeral, finally held 30 years after his death. She didn't attend. Her presence would have been an intrusion on grief finally finding its proper channel. Instead, she stood in her garden as darkness gathered, whispering a prayer not for forgiveness, but for understanding. For Timothy, for Sarah, for Joseph, for herself. Amen, said Jasper from the porch, his voice carrying on the evening breeze. Amen, Clara echoed, turning toward the house that now felt lighter somehow, as if truth had weight and its absence created buoyancy. She walked inside as the first stars appeared, leaving behind the freshly turned earth where old sins lay buried. Tomorrow would come with its own burdens and mercies. For tonight, it was enough that silence had been broken, that words long trapped had finally found their way into the light. Behind her, Jasper's cage stood empty, the door left open. The parrot perched on the porch railing, green wings spread wide, poised between captivity and flight. For a moment he lingered, yellow eyes reflecting the last light of day. Then with a soft cry, he launched himself into the gathering darkness, a flash of color against the purple sky, carrying old words to new horizons. Clara watched him go, one hand raised in farewell. Some truths, once spoken, needed no further keeper.